Hi, Mari and Dominique here. We're two social work students from New Mexico Highlands University in Albuquerque. They say if you can make something simple, you have understood it. That's our goal here. In the Layperson's Guide to the Know Your Rights campaign in New Mexico, we want to take something complex and these emerging concepts in an area that might be new to you and break them down into something you can understand. However, there's an iceberg underneath this ocean, so do us a favor and hunker down while we uncover some of the layers in this densely packed story. This is a presentation on the Know Your Rights campaign in New Mexico for people on the Developmental Disabilities or DD waiver, the MeVia waiver, and the medically fragile waiver. It's also for their family members, advocates, and guardians. There are new rules from the Federal Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, called the CMS Final Rule. It's intended to strengthen the rights of people receiving waiver services, which are also known as home and community-based services. The acronym you'll hear for Home and Community-Based Services is HCBS. That's a lot of acronyms already, just getting started. You might be wondering, what does all that even mean? So let's back up for a minute and review a little bit of that language before moving forward again. Medicaid funds programs that help those with disabilities. It provides government-funded health insurance for children and adults who have a disability and also don't have much money. They need things such as prescription drugs and personal care services and other things that are more extensive than what you get from other health insurance companies. Medicaid also provides long-term care. In the past, that used to mean in institutions. Now it also means community-based care. For example, group homes are paid for with Medicaid dollars, and direct support workers who help people live and work in their communities are paid for with Medicaid dollars. Many people with disabilities live with their families. Medicaid is important not only to the quality of life for people with disabilities, but to the quality of life for their families who care for them. There is no other program that does what Medicaid does for people. When Medicaid is changed, cut, and reduced for vulnerable populations, people's needs are simply no longer met. The final rule changes were intended to be human rights and civil rights improvements for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and for those in medically fragile conditions. Let's review key policies that have occurred in the United States in the past, prior to the 2014 CMS Final Rule that led up to this point in history. And let's discuss a little bit about what Medicaid has to do with human and civil rights for people with disabilities and their families. The key policies stretch back to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. The Medicaid program was implemented in 1966. In the early 70s, there was an interesting news segment by Geraldo Rivera about the Willowbrook Institution in New York State, I believe Staten Island. It highlights a point in history where deinstitutionalization was occurring. There is language we no longer use, and you see social norms that have changed significantly when you watch that segment. I cringed a lot watching it, but it was worth it to observe the progress we've made and think about the progress we still need to make as a society in terms of social justice and inclusion. Regardless of what you think of Geraldo Rivera today, this was influential on changing culture in the 1970s, I believe, in terms of the segregation of people with severe disabilities. The CMS Final Rule relates to some of this history in terms of moving people more and more into the community and extending the ideas from desegregation into actual inclusion. In 1975, the IDEA changed education so that a public school education was mandated for every child, even those with disabilities. From that, inclusive classrooms emerged. 1981 saw the legislation of waiver programs. With waivers, some rules that apply to Medicaid are put aside or waived so that specific needs can be met. States can then find creative ways to meet certain specific needs, such as the needs of those with developmental disabilities and their families. In the early 1980s, research showed a disproportionate percentage of Medicaid resources were being used for institutional long-term care, and several studies showed about 33% of people, or one-third, who were institutionalized could otherwise be capable of living at home or in residential settings if they just had additional supportive services. This one-third of institutionalized people reported a low quality of life, so changes were made. And the HCBS waiver program was established by the Omnibus Reconciliation Act of 1981, and it was incorporated into the Social Security Act at Section 1915. So that became a funding source for waivers. That changed things so that states created waivers, and in 1990 the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed, or the ADA. This has profoundly affected all our lives. And now, after 2014, if all goes well, we're looking at regulations that will profoundly affect how we include people with disabilities in our community settings. Now, back to the present day and our presentation. Here in New Mexico, the Department of Health established a steering committee of about 15 different organizations in order to roll out this Know Your Rights campaign. And so that is who is spearheading this whole thing in New Mexico. So now let's look at the the Know Your Rights campaign in New Mexico implementation of the CMS HCBS Final Rule 2014 wants to make sure waiver participants, my apologies, are included in the community. In New Mexico, it includes all of these waivers, which is the Developmental Disability Waiver, the MUVIA waiver, and the medically fragile waiver. At this time, the Centennial Care Demonstration waiver will be implemented in a separate process as far as we know. So now let's take a look at the difference between the two types of waivers, commonly known as the Centennial waiver and the MUVIA waiver. So first I'm going to just start with Centennial is run by HSD, which is the Human Services Department. And for MUVIA, it's operated by DOH and DDSD, which is the Department of Health and Developmental Disability Division. The eligibility requirements are also different for Centennial. Anyone that receives Medicaid has Centennial and can choose their own MCO. With eligibility for the MUVIA waiver, the DD waiver and the medical fragile waiver is what qualifies you. At this time, the wait list is 10 to 15 years long. So obviously this is a
quite longer of a time frame to get into the MEVIA fragile or the MEVIA waiver. My apologies. And the assessments are also different. For Centennial, the assessment is done over the phone. It's referred to as LOC, which is level of care. And there is 3 levels. Level 1, you would only need a care coordinator to see you 1 time a year. Level 2 is agency-based. And level 3 is agency-based as well, with more care coordinator visits. And then for the assessment for MEVIA, this is done through Qualis Healthcare Contractor. It's always independently contracted. And this is done through age. So there's different age brackets. There's under 18, 18 to 21, and then over 21. And the age requirements under MEVIA just bumps you up with your budget every year until you reach 21. You've pretty much reached the cap of your budget, unless again it's referred back to your level of care. Lastly, the two, or to go back to Centennial, you do have to have 120 days before you get self-direction with an agency. So you have to meet that 120-day requirement before you start and can be placed into your level of care and be placed into a level for what type of need that you would need. Centennial and MEVIA also have a whole other list of different things that qualify you. The main thing that I have noticed with working in participants is Centennial requires you to have a homemaker in the home on your budget before you can have anything else, versus MEVIA. You have a lot more control of your budget and what is on it and what is not. And those mainly are the key elements that I've seen the differences between the Centennial and the MEVIA waiver.
When all is said and done, the goal is that in community settings, people with disabilities will find that they are in facilities that are integrated with full access to the greater community, that their independence is maximized when they make life choices, that as an individual they can choose, or if they have a guardian, in consultation with their guardian, that they can choose among community options, and that these options include settings that are definitely non-disability specific. That's the whole idea of inclusion for everyone. That they're ensured the right to privacy, dignity, respect, and independence. That they're provided an opportunity to seek competitive employment. That they're provided an option to choose where they live. And that their choices of service providers and services are facilitated. As for how this will all be implemented, the MEVIA and the Know Your Rights campaign will be implemented via a transition plan that has to be approved by CMS, or the Center for Medicare and Medicaid, if you recall. Now this is only for the MEVIA waiver side of the house, which again is the DD waiver, the MEVIA waiver, and the medically fragile waiver. You'll recall that there's that Centennial Care side, and they will come up with their own transition plan from what we understand. So this means that residential and non-residential settings need to comply with all the regulations of the legislation. Providers will be graded, and they'll either comply, they'll need technical assistance in order to fully comply, so that's like an action plan that will be overseen by an organization in the state, or they will fail to comply after trying out an action plan, and they'll no longer be able to provide service. And that's a pretty big consequence. So currently, we're taking input from participants about their services and supports in regard to how integrated they find their community access, their level of choice, how they feel about their human and civil rights, their individual rights, and their level of independence. Now that we've looked at the past and the present, let's do a thought experiment on the implications of the CMS Final Rule. We might wonder, what will the future look like for New Mexico's waiver programs, for the inclusive community environment, for individual people? We asked someone smart about the waiver programs. She was our field advisor and the owner of Self-Directed Choices in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Ms. Sandy Scarr. She noted the possible options for the waiver programs appear to be that they may remain the same, they may change but remain separate waivers, or they may merge into one waiver. We thought that was a pretty good set of options to look out for in the future if you're keeping an eye on this sort of thing at the state level. As far as our inclusive communities, who will educate people in the environment on how to think and act? We have spent a long time treating people with disabilities as second-class citizens, and when it comes to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, this is magnified. There are issues such as the legal ability for employers to pay those with intellectual disabilities much lower than the minimum wage, with the justification of lower production levels due to their disabilities. This speaks to segregation again, instead of inclusion in the economic world. It's also debatable in many facets. There are self-advocates who have intellectual disabilities who train themselves and others on laws, regulations, and resources in order to advocate for themselves and their communities. They may well be on the forefront of these changes, along with their families and the significant people in their lives. So we are left to ponder some questions. And bear with me while I go far afield in my imagination. This is a thought experiment. How will the built environments need to be adapted? When will we in the United States, along with the rest of the world, be seeing increased technology as part of a post-human age where man and machine merge more and more, where it becomes more the norm to consider machinery as part and extension of oneself, of what it means to be human? Will we see quadriplegics able to leave their homes more easily and use public restrooms? Will we see wheelchairs allowing paraplegics to stand and reach things just normally? Can we turn the age of automation toward these things and toward personalized medicine more than toward entertainment? What better use could there be for technology? Who facilitates this change? Do we as social workers have some responsibility to think about the social justice of bringing together and conceptualizing the components of government regulation, medicine, technology, and vulnerable populations to tell a story of the future that includes opportunities for growth and healing as well as problem identification? Can we use visionary means to shape cultures of the future? And do we bear some responsibility to help shape a positive future, to help include as many people as possible instead of exclude? If the culture of the future is created by our thoughts and actions of today, how will we craft our social work for those with developmental disabilities on the waiver programs facing changes during the next 2 years, with some of these even larger generational elements occurring? And then there are the implications for individual people. A person with human and civil rights operates within a community, choosing their activities and acting responsibly. They have resources and limits. They make important decisions about their lives. There are many levels of functioning and care. There are many different ways of communicating. There really isn't a normal, even for our stereotypes of normal. And that's a myth that we could really do away with in culture in order to make a more functional way of being for individuals. I think we scare people with the strange overworking culture we have and make it a strange thing for there to seem like there is a, quote, place for pretty much everyone. At least that's been my struggle, and I have to imagine that the families of those with profound intellectual and developmental disabilities must face those questions too, about being scared to lose resources if they integrate more and more into a dysfunctional mainstream community. We need to create a lot more alternatives for self-sufficiency in the future United States if we're to have a robust and integrated future. Options to work to support oneself part-time need to be available, because not everyone can work full-time, despite how radical that sounds to the current, times when you can't afford an apartment on a full-time minimum wage. Regardless of how it sounds, if we don't create some of these options, it will be the individual with the disability that bears the burden for integrating, and not the culture that does anything to move toward meeting the individuals.